Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. To meet Lucy's fantastic Victober challenge to read an underread book published in the same year as one's favorite Victorian book, I read Benjamin Disraeli's Tancred, or The New Crusade. Like so many of you, I was searching for a book published in 1847, the year Jane Eyre was published, and also the publication year of Wuthering Heights, Agnes Grey, and the start of Vanity Fair. A lot of us have been reading books published in 1847. Let me start by saying that I truly loved having a real reader as my president for 8 years. I loved then and I love now seeing Obama's annual book recommendations. The idea of having a prime minister who actually wrote novels is really wild. I used to make the assumption that authors of fiction were people with a kind of empathy that would make good world leaders. But I think after this particular book, I'm rethinking that assumption a bit. To be honest, Disraeli's Tancred derailed my Victober in ways I didn't quite expect. There are things about the novel I really liked, things about it I really hated, and even more stuff that I found really interesting and sometimes troubling in historical ways, but not in literary ways. Incidentally, the Victober derailment continued in a totally different way with George Eliot's Adam Bede, my read for Knit and Listen, but that discussion is for my next video. I mentioned in one of my Sunday sentences that Disraeli's style of characterization in the first part of his novel had certain resonances with Trollope's writing. The author humorously skewers his characters sometimes, in ways that make us laugh at them, but also feel deeply connected. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the early part of the novel is Disraeli's decision to explore the lives of introverts, people who have the means to live by themselves, isolated from the community of other people who still have fulfilling lives. As the plot continues, however, the introverted side of their lives seems to reveal both a naivete and a sense of superiority of the characters and perhaps of Disraeli himself that feels more awkward. Just a side note, let me apologize upfront and say that my lack of knowledge about British history will be appallingly obvious throughout this video. By training, I'm an historian, but my research and writing has all been about the United States South. I'm out of my league here in a book about the other side of the Atlantic. The heart of the novel, Tancred, is the story of a young English aristocrat, assumed to be headed to Parliament, who feels alienated by the culture surrounding him in Victorian Britain. His rejection of the ideas of materialism and secular society make him leave Britain and travel to Palestine in search of a spiritual experience that he can use to transform the culture and politics of England. As the story of Tancred moves to what he calls the Holy Land, everything seems to change. Not only Disraeli's plotline, but the characterization and even the author's writing style. He seems to be writing much broader stereotypes of the people who populate these pages, as well as creating a setting that feels inauthentic, almost painterly. I should have looked up if Disraeli spent any significant time in the land that is now the country of Israel, but if he did, it doesn't really come across in his writing. And although he says it's a Jewish land, he doesn't talk about a synagogue or the Western Wall. Instead, the Holy Sepulchre is at the center of the novel. Anyway, Tancred posits that the, quote, Jewish race is superior to all other races, except perhaps the Saxons. More on that in a moment. He states that the, quote, Jewish race produced the first great legislator with Moses, the first great sage and ruler with Solomon, and the first great reformer with Jesus. Yes, one of the central arguments here seems to be that Christians should recognize that Christianity is Judaism fulfilled. That is, that Judaism is an incomplete belief system in itself. Let me read out one more messianic Disraeli quote, referring to Jesus. Through this last and greatest of their princes, it was ordained that the inspired Hebrew mind should mold and govern the world. Through Jews, God spoke to the Gentiles, and not to the tribes of Israel only. This is the great worldly difference between Jesus and his inspired predecessors. Christianity is Judaism for the multitude, but still it is Judaism. Traditional Jews would strongly disagree with this messianic vision, not particularly that Christianity was an outgrowth of the Jewish faith, but that it was the completed version of Judaism. I wasn't expecting this line of argumentation from an author I thought was grappling with his own Jewish identity. I suppose I see, though, how someone who has been a target of discrimination might want to support a particular belief system or identity, even if that support is also easy to read now as a kind of selling out, to use a modern term. Even more troubling than Disraeli's assumptions about the stability and naturalness of race and hierarchy, and his portrayal of stereotypes of working class Jews, which I'm not going to talk about here, is the concept of Britain's right to dominate Palestine. As I said earlier, Disraeli appears to be arguing that Jews and Saxons are the two great races of the world, and therefore, obviously, England should be the colonial ruler of Palestine. Granted, his argument is a little more subtle than that. To be fair, the novel is very critical of Britain, but mostly because Britain has embraced principles of representative democracy. Tancred makes it very clear that England's imperial expansion into Palestine would reinvigorate Britain itself as something other than a representational democracy, something ruled by the divine. There's no clear explanation what England would give Palestine except their God-given administrative skills. I've been very critical of the politics and assumptions behind this novel, but I do realize that Disraeli's argument for what he calls theocratic equality is at some level meant as reconciliation and respect. Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic, as well as Judaism and Islam, are assumed to have true value and a deep connection, since all these groups are, quote, people of the book. Yes, that actually leaves plenty of people out, including non-religious people, but I think that is Disraeli's symbolic way of saying that all people are one in this multiracial society. I'm going to say something obliquely about the ending of the novel here. Disraeli sets up what could be something of a resolution or reconciliation, granted one that might still be seen as problematic today, but he backs off. The novel ends without closure, and it means that the argument that I think Disraeli has been leading to is completely shut down. Politically, it's frustrating. Narratively, Disraeli's cowardice saps all the movement out of the book. I have no idea where he was heading. If you've read this book and have an idea of what to make of the ending, please let me know what you think down below. I realize I keep conflating the author and the main character in this novel, something I usually don't find myself doing, but this book just seems to call for it. I gather that some people read this as an ironic text, so perhaps that conflation is a big mistake on my part. 2 stars, maybe 3 if you're really interested in British history or really involved in the history of literature. Thanks for joining me for this discussion. See you soon.